Greetings to everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of The Only Kid with a Camera. Today I'm going to be discussing Star Wars. Wow, I have some incredible stories to tell you about Star Wars. Now, I'm about to make a proclamation that may be challenged by someone, but I'm going to make it. I am making the claim that I was the first Star Wars nerd in the entire world. And I have a lot of evidence to back it up. So that's my claim, and in this episode, I'm going to share that evidence with you so that you can experience what it was like to witness the Star Wars phenomenon in 1977. The first film, which is now known as A New Hope, but to me will always be known as simply Star Wars, came out in May of 1977. I was 13 years old. I was the perfect age for this movie to come out and for this whole phenomenon to happen. But I need to give you a little bit of background about some of what led up to Star Wars. The first movie that really tweaked me was the Poseidon Adventure that came out in 1972, and I loved that movie. I saw it, I think when it came out, I saw it 4 times, maybe more. And in those days, you had to go to the movie theater to see your favorite movies. You couldn't purchase movies to watch at home. So the only chance you could see your favorite movie was if you went to the movie theater, or if you were lucky, they might show it on one of the 3 major television networks that were active at that time, which was NBC, CBS, and ABC. And they would show films. They called them the movie of the week. They were usually on Saturday nights or Sunday nights. It was so exciting if they were going to show one of your favorite movies. But anyway, when the Poseidon Adventure came out, my friend Bruce and I, we absolutely flipped over that movie. We loved it. It was so exciting, and there was something so compelling about a disaster, and we loved the effects, and it was just a thrill. And Bruce and I, we had been making movies for a while. As I will tell you later, I discovered my dad's movie camera, his old Super 8 movie camera one day, and I was already a fan of movies, but when the Poseidon Adventure came out, that's when I really got excited about making movies myself. So my friend Bruce and I started making our own movies, which I will share more about later. But what happened after the Poseidon Adventure was released, it was such a massive success that all of the major film studios started releasing their own disaster movies. Now, technically, the movie Airport from 1970 was kind of the start of the disaster movie genre, but that was based on a really popular book. The Poseidon Adventure was when the whole disaster film fad really launched. So you had the Poseidon Adventure in 1972, the Towering Inferno in 1974, and then Earthquake in 1974. So my friends and I, we loved these movies, the cool effects and just things blowing up, and it was just so awesome. And of course, my friends and I started trying to make our own disaster movies. Unfortunately, as the 70s rolled on, there were more sequels to Airport that got increasingly worse as they went on. And then there was movies like The Roller Coaster and The Swarm. So it's like Hollywood does now. They grind everything into the ground. But at least in those days, they were original ideas, unlike today. But the Poseidon Adventure and Earthquake were really the movies that I loved, and it started my whole love affair with movies in general. In the 1970s, there were so many great series of films that were coming out. The James Bond movies were coming out every couple of years, and there was the Pink Panther movies with Peter Sellers that we were so excited every time one of these would come out. But then something really big happened. In 1975, Jaws was released. Now, I am going to do a whole program on Jaws, but I have to tell you, Jaws was such a huge phenomenon in culture. Everyone was just into this movie. It was, of course, it was a famous novel to begin with, but the movie just blew the lid off of the whole motion picture industry. And that's really when the summer blockbuster became a phenomenon that people refer to now. And Jaws was just such an amazing film. I love it to this day. I watch it at least once a year. I'm sure I've seen it well over 100 times in my lifetime. When I was a kid, I went through what I would call stages of fads, but I used to call them my manias. And Poseidon Adventure was one of my big manias, but Jaws was like a serious mania. My friend and I actually tried to build a mechanical shark, but unfortunately the film footage turned out blurry, didn't work out, and the shark fell apart in the water and everything. But anyway, Jaws was a huge deal, huge. And from like 1975 on, I was constantly making films with my friends, and we started getting more serious about the movies and actually make them the way a real film was made. So that leads up to May of 1977, when the first Star Wars film was released. It's hard for me to even begin to express what an incredible event this was. And the first thing that I remember about Star Wars was my good friend, Bob Smith, who lived right up the street from me. And we grew up together. We'd known each other since we were 5 years old. He said, "John, have you heard about this movie, Star Wars?" And I had heard about this movie. This was literally within the first week that it was released. And his parents had gone to see it with him, so I hadn't seen it yet. But I had heard these rumblings at school. Everybody at school was talking about this movie, Star Wars. When I found out that Bob had seen it, I, of course, wanted to know everything about it. And he was like, "You just won't believe it. It's these spaceships and people shooting these laser guns, and there's laser swords." And he was trying to explain something that literally was so different and so unique. And he basically couldn't really find the words to describe it, but it was very clear that he was saying, "You've got to see this movie, you won't believe it." And so I believe it was that next weekend, Saturday, when I decided I have to go see this film. Now, in those days, movie theaters weren't all over the place, and we had basically 3 movie theaters that were kind of in the general vicinity of where we lived. But as I was looking through the newspaper, I noticed that there was this theater in Seattle that was playing Star Wars in 70 millimeter and Dolby surround sound. And that sounded awesome to me, and the theater was obviously promoting this as the premier place to go see Star Wars. So that following weekend, my mom gave me a ride down to Kenmore, downtown Kenmore, where I caught a bus, had to do a couple of transfers, and made my way down to Seattle, downtown Seattle, to the UA Cinema 150, this amazing theater that I was to become very well accustomed to over the next year. And there was, of course, a line all around, the block twice. There was a massive line, so we couldn't actually get into the showing that we had planned to get into, but we did get into the second showing. I really don't know how to describe that experience. All of you have that experience the first time that you watched Star Wars or a Star Wars film. But if you can imagine for, a 13-year-old kid who had never seen anything even remotely like a film like this, it was just absolutely mind-blowing. Well, first of all, when the words Star Wars pop out and start scrolling down into space, that was just amazing in and of itself. But then the camera drops down to this planet, and then this massive spaceship is traveling overhead and seeming like it's never going to end. It just keeps going on and on and on. I remember literally I was pushing myself back in my chair. I was so blown away just by this opening scene. And it was just from there, it was just one mind-boggling scene after another. The story was so captivating and instantly understandable. I knew from the very beginning what was going on. I knew that there was something that the bad guys wanted from the good guys, and that Princess Leia had stuffed it into this robot, but mainly visually and the sound in this theater. It was the first time I had ever heard surround sound. And this screen was actually a curved screen. It was a premiere movie theater. So I'm watching, Star Wars in 70 millimeter for the first time in my life on this massive screen with Dolby sound. And my friend Bruce and I don't think we breathed through the entire movie. It wasn't as if science fiction was totally new to me. I had grown up during the era when Star Trek was played on reruns every Sunday night, and I loved Star Trek. I absolutely loved it. The only bummer about Star Trek was that it would play like around 7 p.m. on Sunday nights on the local television station, and I associate that with the dread of having to go return back to school the following Monday morning. But Star Trek was definitely a thing in my life and in the life of my friends. We loved it. And so when Star Wars came along, we had that in our background. Anyway, I will, of course, go more into depth about that experience. But in this episode, I want to talk about the Star Wars phenomenon and what happened culturally and in my life as a result of this movie, Star Wars, coming out. The first thing about Star Wars in terms of how it affected my life is that I began to see Star Wars every single weekend, sometimes twice on a Saturday, and then I'd go again on a Sunday. And this was no small effort. I had to catch a bus and do a couple of transfers until I got down to Seattle. But the movie became something that was more than just a movie. It was an escape from things that were happening in my home. I had 2 alcoholic parents, and it was a really difficult time. I had an older brother that was very rebellious, and it was just, my home life was a mess. But Star Wars became like an escape for me, I guess. But I don't want to belittle it by making it sound like that's all it was. It was this amazing film, and it couldn't have come at a greater time in my life. It in a lot of ways, it kind of saved me from what was going on in my household at the time. So I started seeing Star Wars pretty much every weekend, at least once, and sometimes twice, Saturday and Sunday, as I said. After that, obviously, there was this onslaught of media about Star Wars. I would see news stories talking about this Star Wars phenomenon and the lines of people, and it was just amazing. And, of course, Star Wars was the cover story on all of the major magazines. So I started buying things. I started buying everything I could get my hands on that had to do with Star Wars. The list is endless, but one thing in particular led me on an interesting journey. Star Wars was released on May 25th, 1977. And 2 months later, People magazine released their first issue about Star Wars. It was the July 18th, 1977 issue. And I bought it, as I bought every magazine that had Star Wars on the cover, and brought it home, started looking through it, and I noticed this photograph of a guy sitting at his desk with all of these Star Wars masks around him. And he was actually wearing one of these Star Wars masks. I'm looking at these masks thinking, how did he get those? Where did they come from? Are they from the movie, the actual movie? Or did somebody make them? Or are they for sale? Now, this is so funny. I was obsessed to find out where these masks came from and how I could get my hands on one, or if I could get my hands on one. So, 13-year-old John Blackstone, what does he do? He does some research and eventually discovers how he can call the main offices of People magazine. And if I'm not mistaken, it was in New York City. Here's this, 13-year-old kid calling some receptionist, I'm assuming, at People magazine, and asking, in your recent issue of People magazine, there's a guy that has these masks, and I just want to ask somebody if they know who that guy is in the picture and how I can get a hold of him. And because I had, a sweet, innocent, young, prepubescent voice. The woman that I spoke to was kind enough to direct me to someone that answered that question. So what ended up happening, thanks to this very kind woman at People magazine, is that she found out that the man in the photograph was a gentleman named Mark Peevers. That's how I pronounce it anyway. He was at the time 20th Century Fox's vice president of licensing, and he was basically the guy that was trying to get as much merchandising out the door as possible. And so he was the guy I needed to talk to. And I proceeded to look up the phone number for 20th Century Fox in Hollywood, and took me a long time. I talked to many people. I think I had my young voice going for me at the time, and I was very polite and persuasive because I wanted to know the answer to my question, who is this guy? Anyway, eventually, after several phone calls, I ended up speaking to Mark Peevers at 20th Century Fox. And he told me the masks are being manufactured by a company called Dawn Post Studios. He gave me the phone number for Dawn Post Studios in Glendale, California. That very day, I made a phone call and I asked, when are you releasing these masks? And how much do they cost, and how can I get my hands on one? I specifically wanted the Darth Vader mask as my first. They were $40 a piece. There was the Darth Vader mask, Stormtrooper mask, Chewbacca mask, and the C-3PO mask. The problem was that I didn't have that kind of money. $40 was a lot of money for a 13-year-old kid in 1977. So after I finished my conversation with Mr. Peevers, I called the Seattle Times newspaper, and I took what was the very first job of my entire life. That very day, I became a paper boy, and I started my first paper out, all with the purpose and intent of having money to buy one of these masks. I had bought a lot of smaller stuff, but there wasn't a lot that was released as of yet. This was only 2 months after the release of the movie, but there was stuff starting to, trickle out, things like notebooks and peaches and kind of more basic stuff, cups and things like that, but none of the cool Kenner toys had been released yet. But these masks were incredibly cool, as any of you know who either purchased one or have looked at them. It was like the holy grail to have one of these masks. So I purchased the mask, and unfortunately, they said that they aren't going to start shipping them out to the public until August. So this was July, and that was a long time to wait for a 13-year-old kid that's been dying to get his hands on one of these things. Anyway, just by sheer good luck, my parents were taking my sister and I to Disneyland in August of 1977. We had never been there before. We had never traveled to California as a family before. And I'll always remember that date, August 77, because while we were on our vacation, that was when Elvis died. And I remember that was such a big deal in the news and everything. It wasn't a big deal to me. I didn't care about Elvis at the time. But anyway, so, I'm waiting for this mask to come, but we're going to be going to California, which is even a bigger drag, because what if the mask is finally delivered, while we're in California? It was almost enough to make me not want to go to Disneyland. I'm not joking. It's true. But anyway, of course, we did go to Disneyland. But somewhere along that path, it dawned on me, I wonder if we could go to Dawn Post Studios so I can get my mask. And Dawn Post Studios was a long way out of our planned trip. This was in Glendale, California. We were visiting San Francisco and then, of course, Anaheim and Hollywood and all that. But I was so obsessed about getting this mask that after begging and pleading and pouting, being the manipulative little kid I could be, I talked my parents into what was essentially a 5-hour drive out of the way during our trip to go to Glendale, California, where Dawn Post Studios was located. Their manufacturing plant was located there. I walk in, and the guy at the front desk gave me a tour of Dawn Post Studios. There sitting is Darth Vader's mask. Now, I know that this was actually one of the masks because it was large. It was not small like the ones that they manufactured. It was a full-size masks, and it had the actual metal parts on it, the bolts. Anyway, it was the real mask. There was also a real stormtrooper mask there. I could have dropped to the floor when I saw this, and he said these are on loan from 20th Century Fox or Lucasfilms so that we could design the molds for the masks that we're making. Can you imagine to see something like that as a 13-year-old Star Wars fanatic? It was just unbelievable. He hands me this box, and he says, "John, you are the first person in the United States or in the world to receive this. We are not shipping these until next week, and here you go." I was just like walking on cloud nine, as you can imagine. I put on that mask and basically didn't take it off. The only time I took it off was when we were going into a restaurant, or of course when we went to Disneyland. I was wearing it constantly. So that's just one of the many amazing stories that I have to tell about the impact of Star Wars in my life. And I have so many archives and images and film that I have compiled to tell the story of my Star Wars obsession. Thank you so much for watching the first episode of Only Kid with a Camera. I'm so excited about the upcoming episode next week. I'm going to be talking more about what happened in our culture as a result of this incredible movie, but there's so many amazing things that happened to me as a result of this movie that I'll tell you about, which will further support my claim that I was the first Star Wars nerd in the world. And then on December 23rd, I'll be releasing my final Star Wars episode, which is going to be titled The First Star Wars Christmas. And I'll be talking about how awesome it was that very first Christmas of 1977 when so many cool Star Wars toys came out. And I'll also talk about what happened with Kenner Toys and how they totally botched it and failed to meet the deadline, which many of you already know that story. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and join this community of folks who are celebrating the awesome decade of the Super 70s. Until next time, this is John Blackstone. I'll see you.